Oh, brilliant. I am live. Hello. Happy Friday. It looks like I'm streaming, but I can't be 100% sure. Um, no, brilliant. I am. People are watching. Hello. Happy Friday. Thank you for joining me. I hope you're well on this rather miserable, rainy, and blustery day. Hello, Ben. Lovely to see you. Thanks for tuning in. Nice and prompt. Um, and also, yeah, love the fresh face. Do you know what? I shaved last night, and well, yeah, while I may look a little bit neater, or what I feel it's done, it's highlighted my desperate need for a haircut. I'm almost starting to grow the beginnings of a mullet, which is very distressing. Hello Hillary, hello Jackie, hello Pat. I'm feeling much happier now you're here, Pat. That is certainly true. Hello Anya, hello Angela, hello Daphne, hello Patricia, hello Denise, hello Karen, hello Ali, hello Julie, hello Rebecca, hello Sue, hello William, coming through thick and fast. But anyway, I'm going to dive straight in because I have a lot to talk about today. So what are we talking about today? Well, oh yeah, actually, before I dive into what I'm talking about, I'll quickly just see. Um, oh, Chris Bissex Foster, you can't record this, but you can watch this back whenever you want. This will be up on our Facebook page indefinitely, so you can certainly watch it back on at your leisure. Yeah, massive thanks, Patricia, to everybody who tuned into the broadcast I did with the People's Friend this morning. I had a great time. Ian's a lovely guy. No one, Linda. No one, Linda. The comments, they're coming through thick and fast. Yeah, People's Friend is a fantastic magazine. If none of you have come across it before, it's kind of all devoted to hobbies, interests. They do some great fiction in there, and luckily for me, they also have a very keen interest in history. So I was thrilled to join them and have a chat about house history this morning, and hopefully we can do more of it again in the future. But what are we talking about today? Yeah, it's lovely to be back after a kind of a week off. I wasn't here last Friday, but I did do a broadcast last Thursday with Deborah Sugg Ryan, the design consultant on A House Through Time. And again, massive thanks to everyone who tuned into that. I really enjoyed that. I'd love to have Deborah back on again. Problem is with things like this, often an hour never feels enough. And obviously you've got to bear in mind people watching because an hour is a long time to watch anyone just talk. Um, but we could, yeah, I felt we only scratched the surface there. So fingers crossed we get her back again because Deborah's just a font of knowledge. And I mean, some of the stuff we had in conversations off live, I wish we'd been able to talk about how like certain items tell these incredible stories. But anyway, we'll get it back on. But yeah, what are we talking about today? Well, today's Friday, which means we've released new records as we do every single week. And this week's release has a distinctively Catholic flavour. We're very proud of our Catholic records at Findmypast, and we're thrilled to have more join our constantly growing collections. And that prompted me to have a little think about the history of Catholicism. I myself am not Catholic, but I went to an incredibly Catholic Christian Brothers run school. I went on pilgrimage to Lourdes. I can still remember my Hail Mary. And I really enjoyed that education. I was fascinated by it, even though it wasn't even my faith. But the Catholic story in Britain is such a long and fascinating one, especially when you consider that Britain isn't assumed to be a Catholic country, and for good reason. After Henry VIII booted the Catholic Church out of England, dissolved the monastery, established the Church of England, Catholics have been in a minority since then. But the picture over time is a lot more complicated. And obviously, for most of our history, for the vast majority of the history of Britain as a country that we'd recognize in the modern sense, Britain was overwhelmingly Catholic. Um, so yeah, I wanted to kind of have a look at that. And as soon as I started researching it, I realized that I'd bitten off far more than I can chew because it's such a fascinating, huge topic that spans so many different areas of life in the UK. So even though this week's records are mainly Scottish Catholics, relating to Scottish Catholics, I'm primarily going to be taking a look at the history of Catholicism in England and Wales. I feel Catholicism in Scotland is such a big story that needs a whole other video itself. And knowing how knowledgeable Miko is on all things Scotland, and particularly the religious history of Scotland, I might ask him to do that. So yeah, we'll be having a look at a grand kind of tour of the history of Catholicism in England, the many challenges Catholics faced at various points in history, and also how those challenges have really shaped British history to the extent that I wasn't really aware of. I mean, doing this research myself, I was like, holy hell, I had no idea that that was related to that, and that led to that, and I didn't even know that person was Catholic, and oh, I didn't realize it was that severe. So yeah, we're gonna have a little bit of a look at that, um, and if provided on how we do for time, well, I'd like to have a look at tips for finding Catholic ancestors, because we do like to think at Findmypast that we are probably one of the best places to do that, thanks to our Catholic Heritage Archive, an incredible initiative that was launched, I believe in about 2017, maybe earlier. And what our aim was with that was to basically digitize as many sacramental registers from as many dioceses and archdioceses across the UK, Ireland, North America, as we physically can. We've got a lot online. There are still many more to come, and it's a wonderful collection. So any chance I get to talk about that, I will jump at it. And then last but not least, I was reading the blog on our sister site, the British Newspaper Archive. Some of you may read the Findmypast blog, but even if you're not a subscriber to the British Newspaper Archive, their blog is amazing. Rose, who works on the British Newspaper Archive team, writes a lot of our blogs. Rose is a brilliant writer and really knows her history, and I just love everything she writes. All of her posts are very illuminating, as are newspapers, so check it out. But there was a guest posted this week. We got an archivist at the National Archives to help us look at some of the specialty newspapers that were used primarily as a source of finding love. So the papers that were almost entirely dedicated to lonely hearts or matrimonial advertisements, like we discussed back in February on Valentine's Day. But more importantly, how these papers were an incredibly important source for members of the LGBT community who were then, risking threat of imprisonment for finding partners or finding people of the same orientation and meeting up, because the options were very limited, and it was used so heavily that the Metropolitan Police even got involved. But we'll see. If I don't get to that this week, we'll cover it another week. So yeah, I really should kick off. Just gonna have a quick look. Oh, some of the comments reminded me about question of the week. I didn't even ask it yet. So what is this week's question of the week? Well, as we're talking about religion and religious records, I just wanted to know what you have discovered about your own ancestors' relationships with churches or religion. Were they part of one parish their whole life? Were they very involved in that parish? Did they convert? Were they into theology? Did they write anything down? Were any of them in the clergy? Or yeah, anything you've discovered about your ancestors' religious life or beliefs, pop them in the comments. Because of course, I think that's an important thing to do when you're researching your family history. Religion was much more central in people's everyday lives, traditionally, than it is today. So for pretty much all of our ancestors, their faith would have been a huge defining factor in who they saw themselves and how they saw themselves and how they lived their lives. So yeah, always something that's worth looking at. Another quick look at the comments before we take a look at this week's records. Ali Murray, I was named after a character in The People's Friend. A few people saying they also need haircuts. Oh, Arwen Dawn, I popped up on your Facebook post. Who am I? Well, I'm Findmypast's PR manager. We do these every Friday, if you're tuning in for the first time. Just an opportunity to chat about family history, hang out with fellow family history enthusiasts, say what's going on behind the scenes, and hopefully learn something new in the process as well. Just having a quick look. Yeah, Mark Lesby, my grandmother was a teacher at a Catholic convent primary school in Beverley in the early 1900s. Yeah, William Shaw also. I'm not Catholic either, but was at a Catholic high school. I think that's very common. Same with my mum. My mum wasn't Catholic, but she went to a convent school. Arwen Dawn, I'm pagan, but went to a Catholic school. There you go. Ali Murray said, my grandmother's Catholic family would not speak to her as she married my grandfather, who was not a Catholic. Well, when you see some of the history of persecution and how badly Catholics were treated for quite a large portion of history, it really does explain a lot of those old resentments that do exist in some people today. I mean, what we're seeing at the moment in the news is a sign that history is very much relevant to the here and now. Um, I'm just saying, question of the week. I have the signature from my 5 times great grandfather from 1779 when he became a Presbyterian minister in Kirkcaldy. He ended up working at a church in Soho in London. Oh, wow, that's quite a move. Peter Street Church. I know it. I know where Peter Street Church is, before ending up moving to Cranshaw in Berwickshire, Scotland, because he didn't agree with someone. Something to do with the French Revolution. This feeds into what I'm about to. Right, yeah, I'm going to crack on so we actually get through this. Daphne saying, Mum always told me not to talk about religion or politics. I'm going to be doing neither. I'm just going to be talking about history, the history of Catholics. So, first and foremost, Friday, new records. What have we got this week? Let's have a look. It's a good old update this week. So this week we've added tons of new Scotland Catholic records. So we've added about 69,000 Catholic parish baptisms, covering about 11 parishes across Scotland. Our collection of Scotland Catholic records actually covers every diocese in Scotland. I believe there's 8 of them, and the collection covers all of them. It's that even though it covers all dioceses, it doesn't currently cover all parishes. But that's what releases like this do. They fill these gaps, and over time it just gets more comprehensive, and you've got more chance of finding something. These are sacramental registers of baptisms. These would have been filled in by the priest conducting the baptism. They'll contain things like the child's name, the birth and baptism dates, parents' names, where they were baptized. So generally quite similar to an Anglican parish register, really. You might get the names of godparents or sponsors. You may get notes to indicate whether they were legitimate or illegitimate, or additional remarks. So, for example, if they were converts, that might be noted down in the register, or if they were, or if their parents had been confirmed or married, those dates might also be popped in the notes, but that's less common. We've also added a load of congregational records. We have congregational records for not just for Catholic communities as well. We also have them for Anglican. And congregational records are really mixed bags. They contain all sorts, things like lists of donations, people who rent pews, that kind of thing. But in this regard, for the Catholic records, they contain things like registers of confirmations and communion. So you'll be able to find out when your Catholic ancestors were first confirmed. Parish lists, which are almost like parish censuses, lists of Catholics in that parish. Again, seat rentals, lists of converts. They're really interesting and a great way of getting a better idea of not only your ancestors' relationship to their local congregation, but also a sense of what that congregation was like, its makeup, what it was, who was part of it. So yeah, they almost shine a nice little spotlight on a tiny section of society, I guess. As well as baptisms, we've also got 27,000 new marriages. Again, these are very in structure, quite similar to what you'd see in an Anglican parish record. The names of the couples, their ages and birth years, the spouses, obviously the names of both the bride and groom, so you'll find out the spouse if you're searching for one person, where and when they were married, and also their father's names. With Roman Catholic sacramental registers, the same rule applies as it does for parish. Always, 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 always look at the image. Don't just rely on the transcript, because you will often find additional information in the image that isn't included in the transcript. In the case of marriages, that's probably things like witnesses, the priest's name. You may even get the couple's address. And last but not least, for the Catholic records this week, we have burials. So about 9,000 of these. Again, very similar to Anglican burials. Burial records are always useful because they allow you to find your ancestor at the very end of their lives, as well as where they were finally laid to rest. And with these records, you'll get the name, birth, death, and burial dates, age at death, which you could also work out from birth year, their occupation, which isn't often included in baptisms and marriages, and also where they were buried. So in terms of revealing occupation, it could be a handy census substitute. If you want to know what your ancestor did between censuses, if they died between censuses, if you can't find them, perhaps that's way of finding out. But yeah, all of these latest editions come from the Catholic National Endowment Trust charity. So huge thanks to those for providing those, and we're just really pleased that our Catholic Heritage Archive is continuing to grow, because we do like to think that it was a bit of a game changer when it first launched. Because prior to the launch of the Heritage Archive, Catholic registers were very hard to come by. Most of them weren't online. They were still held at churches, and your ability to actually view them was pretty much up to the discretion of the priest. So you had to either get him on a good day or hope that you got a new, young, trendy priest rather than a more old school traditional priest. But now that is changing. Diocese, we're forging new partnerships, we're bringing new records online, and we're very happy about it. So yeah, there you go. That's this week's Catholic Records. We've also got some electoral registers for Linlithgowshire. Sorry if I butchered the pronunciation, you know what I'm like. These cover 1864 to 1931, a million new records, so big old update. And these are also great census substitutes, good way of finding your ancestors between the census, as well as descriptions of their property, occupations, their ages occasionally, and if they were renters, the names and addresses of their landlords or who they paid rent to. And of course, as we covered in the house history section, up until 1914, 90% of the UK was renters. We only started transitioning towards a kind of home owning society after the First World War, and it's finally starting to reverse back the other way. So we've also got an update for the Billion Graves Cemetery Index. These are GPS tagged cemetery records. So if you've got ancestors who are buried in Scotland and you fancy taking a trip up there to visit the country, which I fully recommend, beautiful country. I'm so jealous of Scotland's wilderness. I wish we had, yeah, it's just stunning, stunning country, always worth a visit, and lovely, lovely people as well. But if you are visiting and your ancestors died there, why not go visit their grave? Pay your respects. And Billion Graves Cemetery Index is the best way to do that. You will get exact GPS tagged coordinates for your ancestor's headstone, if it still exists, or the plot if the headstone is no longer there. And then last but not least, we've got a big old newspaper update with some interesting new titles. The Link, which was one of these kind of lowly hearts, matrimonial advertisements kind of geared newspapers. Let me just see if I can find a quick description of it. Link was first published in 1915, and it was devoted to love interests. One edition alone contained features such as royal love stories, looking at the meeting between King Edward and Princess Alexander. Another article, The German as a Lover. Which comes with some great advice for people looking for young women in Germany. If a girl is not engaged at 25, she's considered a failure and is generally admitted to be on the shelf. And also great advice columns on things like how to treat a broken engagement. And apparently that is with dignity. I'd expect nothing less from our ancestors. So before we start looking at the long and storied history of Catholics in England and Wales, let's have a quick look at the comments. Linda Salter, my Scots ancestor, was split with one branch Presbyterian and the other Italian origin, branch not surprisingly Catholic. Very interesting, yeah, typical of the Scottish story. Lots of fragmentation up there and different religious denominations. That's the word I was looking for. Sylvia Valentine said, one of the leaders of the anti-vaccination society in my hometown was an educated at Atworth Quaker school here in Yorkshire. Again, Quakers, they've got a fight. Quakers is another topic I'm going to have to look at another time, because that's just fascinating as well. So Elaine M. Keir said, the majority of my lines are Irish Catholic, but I recently found records that indicate my Scottish line that I thought were always Presbyterian were confirmed in the Scottish Catholic Church. Well, we've got the records for you to find out, so definitely go and have a look. Right, I can see loads of comments, and I'm concerned that if I carry on reading all your wonderful comments right now, I won't start talking about Catholic history, and we'll be here till 7 o'clock. So, right, I hope you're sitting comfortably, because this is going to be long. No, I'm only joking. I'm going to make it as snappy as I can. So, Catholicism in England. Where did it all begin? Oh, actually, looking at my notes on Catholicism, I've just remembered One of the other things I will be announcing at the very end of this video is the winners of our Instagram prize draw. I believe there are 4. Each of you have won a 1-month sub. So stick around till the end to hear the winners. And if you are a winner and you're not listening, which I don't know why I'd be saying that if you're not listening, we'll still contact you via email. So it doesn't matter, even though you'll never hear this. It's been a long week. Right. Catholicism. Where did it all begin? Let's get my notes up because I learned a lot today. Right, so as I said, goes back a long way. Much of Great Britain obviously was incorporated into the Roman Empire in 43 AD, when Emperor Claudius led the Roman conquest of Britain. And prior to that, the indigenous religious traditions of Britain, of course, were Celtic paganism, Druids. The Druids were violently suppressed, obviously, most notably when General Gaius Paulinus launched his attack on Ynys Mons, which I believe is in Anglesey, in 60 AD. That's when they destroyed the shrine and the sacred groves there. But basically, over time, the Roman influence grew in Britain, and as the influence grew, so did Roman religions. Several religious cults from Roman society came into Britain. You know, the Roman worship of the Roman gods, Mithraism. I mean, if any of you have been to, if any of you have had the chance to visit the Mithraeum in London, it's amazing. Also, the imperial cult. But one of these religions that came over was Levantine originated Christianity. Of course, it spread from the Middle East throughout the Roman Empire, and the Romans brought it with them to Britain. But at this time, it was still very heavily persecuted by the Romans. We don't know exactly who brought it to Britain, but some of the earliest British figures considered saints are people like St. Alban, St. Julius, St. Aaron, and they were all active in the 3rd century. So basically dates all the way back to the 3rd century, we think. Eventually, Roman society changed, becoming more Christianized, and the Roman authorities moved from hostility towards toleration. And there were a load of edicts that kind of bolstered the strength of Christianity in Roman society. And by 380 AD, it was a key component in Romano-British culture, society, and identity, really, I guess. And even really ancient records note that some Romano-British bishops, such as a guy called Restitutus, which is a brilliant name, isn't it? Bishop Restitutus, were quite important bishops and attended councils in Europe, like the Council of Arles, which was in 1314. So even as early as 1314 AD, you're starting to get this kind of Catholic identity coming forward in Britain. Obviously, the Romans eventually left Britain. They were replaced by the Germanic invasions. Obviously, the Anglo-Saxons were the ones who ended up inheriting the country, I guess. And even though contact between Britain and continental Europe really kind of decreased during this period of the post-Roman, Christianity did flourish in a distinctly Brittonic way, really, almost. And it was during this period that loads of different practices and traditions started to take hold in Britain and Ireland that are collectively known as Celtic Christianity, I guess. And the unique features of Celtic Christianity would be things like, you know, unique calculations for the date of Easter, I guess. Basically, the distinctions were not that distinct. So historians don't really separate British Christianity from Western European Christianity as a whole. Anyway, so yeah, that's when the Romans came over. But it was in 597 AD that Pope Gregory started sending over missionaries to start converting the Saxons. Pope Gregory I sent the very famous Saint Augustine of Canterbury over, along with 40 other missionaries, and they started evangelizing to the Anglo-Saxons. And by the 7th century, this process was largely complete, and the Saxons were completely Christianized and were now Catholics. I guess. I'm trying to think this. Yeah, it was during this period when after Pope Gregory sent these missionaries over that was the first time that Rome started to pursue greater unity with the local church in Britain. and started to kind of exert their influence more. And British Christianity started being something that was evolving on its own and became much more tied to the Pope and Rome, as well as finally agreeing on the date of Easter, which was quite a major turning point. Missionaries that came over also introduced the rule of Benedict, which is basically the continental form of monastic tradition, I guess. They started implementing that in Britain, so English monasteries started becoming more like the Benedictine monasteries on the continent. Again, it was all drawing religious life closer to Rome. And as a result, the Pope became, for the first time, an important figure in British politics. I think you should even say English politics, of course, because there was distinct kingdoms back then. I can't forget that. So, for example, in 808 AD, Pope Leo III, he helped restore King Eardwulf. They had great names, those Saxons, didn't they? Of Northumbria to his throne. Also, in a couple of years later, about 50 years later, Pope Leo IV confirmed and anointed Alfred the Great, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. And for Alfred and the Saxon monarchy, that was a huge symbol. He'd been officially recognized by the Pope, which starts to show you how much control Rome now had in England. And over time, that control built until the inevitable split, which we will get to in a little bit. But also, this was also a period during the individual monks, Benedictines, started to play quite an important role. So, for example, quite a famous one some of you may have heard of is St Dunstan, who was consecrated as Archbishop of Canterbury in 960 AD. And he was appointed to restore discipline basically in the existing monasteries in England, and most of them had been destroyed by Danish invaders, so it was a tough time. But things start to change again with the Norman conquest. I promise you I'm getting to more recent history fairly shortly. So, control of the English church kind of was shared between Rome and the Saxons until the Normans arrived with the Norman conquest. And the two clerics probably most prominently associated with this period were both born in Europe. So Lanfranc and St Anselm. I actually went to St Anselm's College, named after St Anselm's, and they were both Benedictine monks. And it was during this kind of medieval period following the Norman conquest that monasteries and convents, such as those at Shaftesbury, there was another famous one at Shrewsbury, which I've actually visited, they started to become really prominent features of society that were providing lodging to people, hospitals as well. They started to heal the sick, and education. That's where people learned to read and write. And likewise, schools like Oxford University and Cambridge, which go back way further than most people realise, the Catholic Church was very involved in those. Religious orders like the Dominicans and the Franciscans actually had presences in both schools and maintained houses for students. And clerics like Archbishop Walter de Merton, who was a Catholic archbishop, founded Merton College in Oxford, which, these kind of legacies left by Catholicism, Catholic bishops, still very much alive today and still very present on the English landscape, I guess. And three different popes actually gave legal protection and statuses to Cambridge and Oxford, making sure they were seen as important as other European medieval universities. And it was also during this era, this kind of medieval period, that pilgrimage became a very prominent feature of medieval Catholicism. And people probably don't realise, but England and Wales had loads of very, very popular sites for Catholic pilgrims. So, off the top of my head, is it Walsingham? Is that how you pronounce it? Walsingham in Norfolk. That was a very important shrine after a noble woman. I can't remember her name. A local noblewoman. She had a French-sounding name, so she would have been from Norman stock. She apparently experienced a vision of the Virgin Mary there in 1061, and they built a replica of the Holy House in Nazareth, and it became a hugely important religious site that people would travel to from all over the country. Other very holy shrines were Holywell in Wales, which commemorated St Winifred. And at Westminster Abbey, you had the tomb of Edward the Confessor, which was also a very, very popular place of pilgrimage. But of course, the most famous one is Canterbury. And that the story behind Canterbury is fascinating. You probably know it already, but in 1170, Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, formerly a very close pal of the king, was murdered in his cathedral by followers of Henry II. Henry had actually asked Thomas Becket to become Archbishop of Canterbury, thinking that having his man in such a senior position would mean he'd be able to challenge the authority of Rome a little bit more. But what he didn't realise was that Thomas Becket was going to take that position very seriously and started siding with the Pope over Henry in various disputes. To this day, historians dispute whether Henry actually ordered the murder of Becket or whether he made an offhanded remark. I can't remember the line. I wish someone would rid me of that troublesome priest, something like that. But anyway, it was done. And Becket was very quickly canonized, became a martyr of the Catholic faith. And as a result, this made Canterbury Cathedral one of the most important international pilgrimage sites in Europe almost, and was immortalised by Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. So every single character in Canterbury Tales was travelling to Canterbury to honour the martyrdom of Thomas Becket when he died in a very gruesome manner as well. I believe they chopped the top of his head out. Actually, it's too gruesome. We'll save that for another time, not on a rainy Friday afternoon. And some of you may not also realise that there was even an English Pope once with a fantastic name. An Englishman by the name of Nicholas Breakspear became Pope Adrian IV, and he was Pope from about 1154 to 1159. So not very long, but there was an English Pope. And 56 years after that, there was a guy called Cardinal Stephen Langton, who was the first of English cardinals and later Archbishop Canterbury. And he was a really interesting guy as well, because he was a very pivotal figure in the dispute between King John and Pope Innocent III. And obviously, I keep on saying obviously, but it's not obvious. This critical situation, this big dispute between the two, was one of the contributing factors to the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215, which, among other things, insisted that the English Church should be free of ecclesiastical appointments fixed by the king. So it aimed to prevent exactly the kind of thing that happened with Thomas Becket. Well, not that priests were going to get killed. It was mainly to stop English kings from putting their mates in positions of religious power and trying to challenge the Pope's authority on matters of religion. But it's during the Tudor period that things get really, 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 really interesting, I think. Because the dynamics of kind of the bond between church and state in England had remained pretty much unchanged for about 1,000 years. And by that I mean there was no significant difference in faith in the way Catholicism was practiced in England versus the rest of Catholic Christendom, especially after, I guess there was the difference in when Britain celebrated Easter, but that was resolved in like 667. So yeah, for 1,000 years, this dynamic was largely unchanged. There was a bit of push and pull. You had certain kings who were less pious than others and would try and challenge the authority of the Pope, but by and large, it remained largely unchanged. But of course, that all changed when King Henry VIII comes along in 1534. That's a real watermark moment for Catholics in Britain. A huge change. Probably one of the most important moments in the entirety of English and maybe British history, I think. I think that's probably fair to say. Because between 1533 and 1536, Henry put forward a load of different legislative acts that basically booted the Catholic Church out of England, made England completely independent of the Holy See, formed a national church, which is still in existence today, the Church of England, and placed Henry himself as the supreme head of the church. Queen Elizabeth herself, still fills that position within the Anglican Church. I think I don't need to go into the reasons behind it. You all know the story. Henry wanted to marry someone he couldn't. He was already married to Catherine of Aragon. He begged for divorce. The Pope would not give him one. And the rest, as they say, is history. I guess one of the things that I didn't realise as well was that for Henry, I think this was very much a practical thing. Henry wasn't that fond of Protestants. He kind of resisted fiercely a lot of Protestant innovations that were coming before this. Um, and even after he got rid of the Catholic Church in England, he did promote toleration. Um, it was Elizabeth who was under Elizabeth's reign when things got really bad for Catholics, to be honest. And he even um, message, nothing to do with this. He even promoted members of the clergy with. Um, no, I've got that the wrong way around. I was going to say he he kind of tolerated Protestantism, um, even though he didn't really like it. And before this, he'd started to promote Catholic clergy members with Protestant sympathies, hoping that they'd support his background. Anyway, probably don't need to go into that because you could do a whole documentary on Henry's split with Rome. Big story. We kind of we know the story. But yeah, this is when Catholicism started to rapidly decline. 1536 was when Rome also enforced separation. That's when Rome said, "All right, England, you're on your own. You're excommunicated. Good luck getting into heaven." And there were some uprisings. Catholics in Britain weren't happy. There was the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536, which was quite a violent uprising in Yorkshire. There was Bigods' Rebellion in Cumberland and Westmoreland. That was in 1537. That was led by a Catholic aristocrat called Sir Francis Bigod. And there were a load of other uprisings dotted around the north. But every single one of them was repressed very bloodily. Um, and from 1536 to about 1541, Henry VIII kind of engaged in his large-scale dissolutions of the monasteries, which controlled most of the wealth of the church and did hold most of the richest land in England. He disbanded them all, the priories, the convents, the friaries in England, Wales, and Ireland. Scotland was left untouched because Scotland was still it had its own king with its own court. And one of the things I find interesting about this, though, is he appropriated all of this, their income, their assets, their land, not for the English church, for himself, which gives you an idea that for Henry, this wasn't a religious crusade. This was very much a practical thing for him, I think. And a lot of it, or a lot of the wealth that he kind of nicked, did nick really, was used to fund the many wars. He was very fond of fighting on the continent. He did provide pensions for former residents who were evicted off their land, so he wasn't totally heartless. Um, but as I said, he kept these properties for himself. And loads of historians have argued that the dissolution of these monasteries probably was one of the most revolutionary events in English history, given that we never had a revolution like the French did, for example. It was a huge distribution of wealth. Unfortunately, I guess it didn't impact normal people though. I mean, before this, there were 900 religious houses in England, around 260 for monks, 300 for regular canons. There were 142 nunneries, 183 friaries, and something like 12,000 people in total were involved in the clergy in some way, like 4,000 monks, thousands of canons, friars, 2,000 nuns. And one stat I've seen, which just shows how important religion was in everyday life, was one adult man out of every 50 was in religious orders. Isn't that crazy? In the 1530s, one adult man out of every 50 was a member of religious order. Um, so yeah, nevertheless, even though he got rid of all this, Henry did maintain a strong preference for traditional Catholic practices, really. And during his reign, Protestant reformers who were like, "Oh, now's our chance," weren't able to make the changes they wanted to. He resisted it fiercely. In fact, Henry's reign saw the trial for heresy of Protestants as well as Catholics who resisted his policies. So it wasn't just the Catholics being persecuted; he was also so there were also people saying you haven't gone far enough, Henry, and he was also trying them for heresy as well. Of course, once Henry died, his young son, the boy king Edward, took the throne, and Edward's reign saw probably the first real experimentation with Protestantism. Under Edward's reign, Latin Mass was replaced by the English Book of Common Prayer. That's when they started to kind of get rid of representational art, knock down statues in church buildings, and a load of the Catholic practices which had somehow survived intact during Henry's reign, for example, saying prayers to the Virgin Mary in public, they all ended under Edward's reign. But then, after Edward died, isn't history great? Then comes Mary, Queen Mary I, otherwise known but as Bloody Mary. And this, just such a tumultuous time. In 1553, the English church was very fractured. And then Mary comes along and links it anew to continental Catholicism. She was pretty much determined to return the whole of England to the Catholic faith at any means necessary. And one of the things I find really interesting about this, shows how complicated history can be, is that her aims weren't really that out of line with a lot of the population. A lot of the population agreed with her. A lot of the population were way up for this. It was the way she went about it that turned so many people against her. It was the execution of 300 Protestants by burning them at the stake that proved very counterproductive. It was a very harsh measure, obviously, but you can't get much harsher than burning people at the stake, but it proved extremely unpopular amongst the populace. So there was even Fox's Book of Martyrs, which kind of was glorified Protestants killed at the time. That vilified Catholics very heavily, and Fox's Book of Martyrs actually ensured her place in popular memory as Bloody Mary. And for many centuries after, the idea of reconciliation with Rome and bringing Catholicism back to Britain kind of rekindled images of people burning at the stake in many people's minds. So ultimately, her harshness, while it was a success immediately, it alienated a fairly large section of English society and paved the way for Catholicism to die out even further, I guess, really. And then after Mary, we've got Elizabeth, and Elizabeth was the one who really doubled down on kind of sorting out the religious situation in England. When she became queen in 1558, the religious situation was very confused. There's been this seesawing from the reigns of Henry to Edward to Mary. No one really knew where they stood. And a significant proportion of the population, especially in the rural parts of Britain, probably held Catholic views or were very conservative in their religious beliefs. But nevertheless, Elizabeth, fierce Protestant, did away with pretty much all the rituals that would have been used to celebrate her accession in parishes across Britain. So when she came to the throne, people in parishes all over Britain were celebrating with Catholic style rituals. Elizabeth got rid of them. Her first act was to reverse her sister's re-establishment of Catholicism by Act of Supremacy and Uniformity. So the Act of Supremacy in 1558 made it a crime to assert the authority of a foreign prince, prelate, or other authority, and was basically designed at getting rid of all of the authority of the Pope in England. And then she went a step further by implementing the Oath of Supremacy, which was imposed by the Act of Supremacy in 1558. And that basically meant that any person taking public or church office in England had to swear allegiance to the monarch as the supreme governor of the church. Failure to swear to this was a crime, and in 1562 it was made high treason, which meant you could be executed for refusing to sign these oaths. So it gives you an idea of how harsh the laws were in place at that time. So during the first years of Elizabeth's reign, there was relative leniency, provided that Catholics were willing to keep their religion private and weren't practicing it outside of their own homes. And the wording of the official prayer book had actually been very carefully worded to omit any aggressively heretical matter, I guess, that could offend English Catholics and cause more trouble and uprisings. And many English Catholics at first actually worshipped side by side with their Protestant neighbours. They joined the same churches. That was until Pope Pius V issued a bull in 1570, which declared that Elizabeth was not a rightful queen, should be deposed. He formally excommunicated her, forbid Catholics from worshipping alongside their Protestant neighbours, and also said that every true Catholic was obliged to attempt to overthrow her. And you can probably see where that went. That didn't work out too well for Catholics in England. In fact, it worked out terribly for them. In response to this act, Elizabeth issued her own act, which had this amazing name. She issued the Act to Retain the Queen's Majesty's Subjects in Their Obedience. And this was passed in 1581. It made it high treason to reconcile anyone or to be reconciled to the Romish religion, as they called it in the exact language of the day. So basically, they made being a Catholic high treason. And now Catholics were viewed as traitors. That's what the association was. Catholic traitor. They want to destroy the monarchy. They want to help the Spanish invade. It was and Catholics started to be viewed with suspicion. So at the start of her reign, it was relatively harmonious. They were worshipping side by side. But after the Pope's bull and Elizabeth's response, that's when things got very, very, very nasty. Under these acts, the celebration of Mass was prohibited under penalty of a fine of 200 marks and imprisonment for 1 year. A fine of 100 marks was given, and the same imprisonment was, 200 marks if you held Mass, 100 marks if you attended. It also increased the penalty for not attending Anglican services. Catholics were compelled by law to attend Anglican services. If they didn't attend, they could be fined a sum of £20,000, £20, not £20,000, £20 a month, which then was just a lot, or imprisonment until the fine was paid off, or until the offender converted to the Protestant church. So they've been very, very persecuted here. And there were more fines. So if anyone was found to be keeping a schoolmaster who did not attend a Protestant service, they were fined. Schoolmasters would be imprisoned. And then things got even worse for the poor Catholics. Wars with Catholic powers such as France and Spain, which culminated in the attempted invasion by the Spanish Armada in 1588, that unleashed huge nationalistic feelings, which equated Protestantism with loyalty to the crown and to the country, and associated Catholics with treachery and trying to undermine the national security. And it really did make Catholics vulnerable to active traitors. And yeah, it was just not. It must have been a terrifying time to be a Catholic in England or Wales. I guess the climax of her persecution reached its peak in about 1585, 2 years before Mary was actually executed, where Elizabeth issued this act against the Jesuits. And that basically meant, no, it's called the Act Against Jesuits, Seminary Priests, and Other Such Like Disobedient Persons. This was the statute under which the vast majority of England's Catholic martyrs were executed. It made it high treason for any Jesuit or any seminary priest to be in England at all, and a felony for anyone to harbour and relieve them. And I noticed some people were talking about priest holes last week. This was the act that led to people creating priest holes to hide a priest, because if you were caught with a priest in your house, not only was that priest going to get a very sticky end, but you were going to be in some very, very, very hot water yourself. I guess the last of our Catholic laws was they had such good names, the Act for the Better Discovery of Wicked and Seditious Persons, terming themselves Catholics, but being rebellious and traitorous subjects. And this basically, can't believe this, it prohibited any Catholic from going more than 5 miles from their place of abode. They weren't allowed to travel more than 5 miles from their house. And to order all persons suspected of being Jesuits or seminary priests who didn't. So basically, it said if someone was asked if they're a Jesuit or a priest, they basically had to say yes, and if they didn't, they'd be imprisoned until they did so. So there you go. You can see it must have been not a good time. And during this time, priests had to be trained abroad. They were smuggled. There was an underground network of priest smuggling hidden in priest holes. But even despite this, by the end of Elizabeth's reign, 20% of the population had still held on to their Catholic beliefs. And Catholics, there were still more Catholics than Puritans, dissident Protestants. There was about 10% of them. And by the end of Elizabeth's reign, most people had been largely de-Catholicized. But I don't know if you could even say they were truly Protestantized. It was still a bit messy. During the Stuarts, there was more seesawing. The reign of James I was marked by quite a good deal of religious tolerance until the Gunpowder Plot, until Guy Fawkes and his fellow conspirators attempted to kill the king and Parliament. That led to a mix of persecution and tolerance, really. So Ben Jonson and his wife, for example, in 1606, they were summoned before the authorities for failure to take communion in the Church of England. But on the other hand, while they were prosecuting Catholics for not attending Anglican services, the king did tolerate some Catholics at court. So George Calvert, who was made Baron Baltimore, or the Duke of Norfolk, who was the head of the very, very powerful Howard family, who remained Catholics. Reign of Charles I, the reign of Charles I saw a bit of a revival. Thanks, Miko. For a shorter version of this, I could read the Bible. I'd be done quicker. That is true. Yeah, I'll probably draw this to a close then on that note. So yeah, basically Charles I, bit of revival of Catholicism in England, especially amongst the upper classes. Charles I even had a Catholic wife, Henrietta Maria. She was permitted to have her own royal chapel, and she had her own chaplain. There was, during the reign of Charles there was a counter-reformation in Europe as well that started to lead to more magnificent forms of Catholicism. That's when you see things like Baroque art, architecture, music, blossoming in Austria, Italy, and Germany. That started to attract some more converts in England. There was some famous poets and artists who came around and returned to the faith as well. And then I'm trying to get through this, sorry, quickly now. So yeah, then you get to the restoration of the monarchy under Charles II. So Charles II saw he wanted to bring back a Catholic influenced court, just like his father, Charles I. Charles had very Catholic leanings. He even, I think, he converted to Catholicism on his deathbed, actually, but he started to put a load of laws in place that made things a little bit more relaxed. And then you have the last Catholic monarch, James II. He was the last Catholic monarch to reign in England and Scotland and Ireland. His brother was James, Duke of York, and he basically, James's reign led to more troubles. James had clear intent to work towards the restoration of the Church of England. Restoration of the Church of England to the Catholic Church. People could see that when James took power, Catholicism was going to be brought back. Protestant fears mounted even faster as James placed Catholics in major commands, particularly in the standing army. That really freaked people out. He dismissed the Protestant Bishop of London, dismissed Protestant fellows from colleges, all that kind of stuff, and people could see the writing on the wall. That led to the Glorious Revolution, of course. Parliament deemed James to have abdicated because of his Catholicism. So they favoured his Protestant daughter-in-law and nephew, William I. It was basically a coup spearheaded by a foreign army, but they were invited to come. James fled into exile. Loads of Catholics fled with him. So you had this kind of mass exodus of leading Catholics, nobility, gentry. They were all leaving England, sorry. And after the reign of William and Mary, that's when the road to emancipation finally started to begin. Persecution, so from 1868 to the early 19th century, while in some points they were the lowest points for Catholicism in England, the persecution wasn't as violent as it was in the past, but during this era, Catholic influence kind of reached its very lowest point. The percentage of the population was probably only about 14% in 1700, which is very small. And in 1800, they only reckoned 1% of the population was Catholic. And the reason for that was because Catholics had their civil rights very, very, very severely curtailed. They had very severe restrictions on what property they could own or what land they could inherit. They were burdened with special taxes. They couldn't send their children abroad for Catholic education. They also couldn't vote, and priests were still liable for imprisonment. I mean, I guess there wasn't. Yeah, I mean, also during this time, like during Stuart times, you still had some Catholics at court. This was gone now. Most of the notable Catholic nobles had fled along with James. They'd gone into exile, and those that had stayed hid their Catholicism. They conformed to Anglicanism, and yeah, over time it just really started to wither away, I guess. Amongst the aristocracy, it survived a little bit better. They did tend to intermarry. They'd still hold their prayers. They just wouldn't describe it as mass. They could get away with it a little bit more. I mean, interestingly, one area where working class Catholics could actually find religious tolerance was the army. That amazed me. So generals, basically, English generals didn't deny Catholic men their mass and didn't compel them to attend Anglican services. Basically, arguing that their physical strength and devotion to the military struggle was what they cared about, not spiritual allegiance. As long as they could fight and they were fighting for the right side, it didn't matter how they'd said their prayers. And yeah, so things got easier over time. I mean, even you did have some prominent Catholics. Alexander Pope, one of the probably best authors and playwrights, satirists in English history, one of the most celebrated minds of the Augustan age, I guess. He was outwardly Catholic. The Howard family, still, they were the Duke of Norfolk. He was a Catholic. And I think 1778 was when things finally got easier. In 1778, the Catholic Relief Act finally allowed Catholics to own property. It allowed them to inherit land. It allowed them to join the army. There were hardline Protestant mobs that reacted to this. There was the Gordon riots in 1780. They attacked any buildings in London which were associated with Catholicism or that were owned by Catholics. And then after this 1778 Relief Act, other reforms gradually came into place. Catholic missions were finally allowed to be set up in larger towns. Stonyhurst College, which was re-established in 1791, that's a very well-known example of that. But I mean, largely they still remained as a small group living in pockets. They weren't spread out evenly across Britain. So I'm trying to think of particular regions. So I think Cumbria, rural Lancashire was a hotbed of Catholicism. Cumbria, that still held onto a lot of Catholics as well. And by the 18th century, Catholics, especially those who kind of had a social position that gave them access to powerful people, were now playing a significant part in life and weren't as people think today. Promise you, I'm nearly at the end now. Oh, sorry, I've just had a pop up from something and it's. Oh no, I'm still going live. Sorry, I accidentally opened an email which made my screen vanish. Yeah, so Catholic revival really started in the 19th century, I'd say. The first signs occurred when loads of French Catholics fled France during the French Revolution. The leaders of the French Revolution were virulently anti-Catholic, and they were executing priests and nuns. They were committing massacres. It was happening in England, which is quite remarkable given the previous couple of centuries. By this period, England was seen as a safe haven for French Catholics. Loads came over. And at the same time, that's when the new political entity of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland was formed. That merged the Kingdom of Great Britain with the Kingdom of Ireland. That increased massively the number of Catholics in this new state. And with this new increased pool of Catholic population, pressure to abolish anti-Catholic laws grew. And as with many things, the need for war drove a lot of this. The Napoleonic Wars were raging. Manpower was desperately needed, and the army needed Catholic men. I mean, there were many Irish regiments in Wellington's armies, for example. And they were going to struggle to recruit Catholic soldiers if they were persecuting their friends and family. So the need for troops also led to it. 1829, probably the last real culmination of this. George III kind of resisted it, but Parliament passed the Roman Catholic Relief Act in 1829, which gave Catholics almost, not exactly, but almost equal civil rights with non-Catholics. It gave them the right to vote, provided they had the correct property, the right to hold public offices, and then last but not least, you had another wave of immigration following the Irish famine. So during the 1840s and 50s, you had loads of Irish migrants passing through England on their way to the United States, but many of them stayed. And that is why, to this day, you have large established communities in cities like London, Liverpool, Manchester, Glasgow, but also in villages and towns all over the country. And that gave England its last big numerical boost for Catholics. And yeah, what a kind of difficult but fascinating history with peaks and troughs of different moments. And I hope you see, like I learned, that how much it influenced great moments in British history. I think the note to end it on, that it wasn't until 1914 that Britain finally restored links with the Vatican. After 350 years, it wasn't until 1915, and it was raised to full diplomatic status in 1982. And the Francis Campbell, who was the first Roman Catholic ambassador appointed to the Vatican from Britain in 400 years, only presented his credentials to the Pope in 2005. There you go. So yeah, my mouth is very dry. Thank you for everybody who had the patience to stick with that. Let's go have a look at some comments. Early 18th century Catholic wills are enrolled. Great comment. Audrey say, oh yeah, Audrey, I remember. Audrey, I used to live in a house that had its own Catholic chapel. Yes, the priest hall and ghost. It was Wootton Hall. I remember you telling me about that. Yeah, perfect illustration. Yeah, talking about the soldiers, a cynic might say that Catholic canon was just as good as any other. I think you're probably right. So I'm gonna have a quick look at the comments, just see what everyone. Thank you to everyone that's been commenting. Yeah, people talking about priest holes. The people talking about that fantastic dramatization they did of the gunpowder plot on BBC a couple of years ago. I thoroughly enjoyed that. I can't remember the name now though. Brilliant. Well, just seeing all the comments. Thank you everybody for the comment. Thank you everybody very much for commenting. And so before I go, I've done it again. I've given myself far too much to talk to, and now I don't have time to look at the newspaper discovery. But if you're curious about that, I urge you all to go over to the British Newspaper Archive, read their blog. It's actually titled, I'll post it in the comments after this. It's called Cupid's. It's called guest post from Cupid's Messenger to the Link. How did LGBTQ people meet in the early 20th century? Fascinating blog written by Vicky Iglakowski-Broad, who's works as the principal diverse histories record specialist at the National Archives. I didn't know about any of this until I read the blog, and I found it absolutely fascinating. So give it a read. Before I go, I will quickly announce the winners of our Instagram giveaway. So if you're watching, huge congratulations to Jennifer at Ira Historian, Jan at Skylark590, and Alice at Alice Kitely. Huge congratulations to you three. You've all won a 1-month pro sub each. Someone from our customer support team will be in touch with you next week so you can claim your prize. Yeah, so congratulations. And yeah, thank you to everyone for this. Was quite a monologue, so thank you for sticking with it. It's been a long one. I hope you enjoyed it. And yeah, have a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful weekend. I think I probably do need a beer now. Do you know what? Yeah, I'll do. I did say I would. I'm going to do one, but see if I can remember. I'm not playing the whole song, but I've promised, haven't I? Is it even tune? Right. One verse of Norwegian Wood, is it? Oh no, massacred it. That's all you get for now. Out of tune. Need a tune. But yeah, thank you very much for everyone tuning in. I will be back again very soon. Have wonderful weekends. Bye bye. Take it easy. Stay safe.